Hey Boost students, it's Miss Hall here with the first video for our new unit on poetry. Over the course of this 9 weeks, we're going to use the book Bronx Masquerade along with some videos to look at the different elements of poetry. Alright, so let's start off with a very basic definition of what is poetry. Poetry is a type of literature that uses figurative language to create an emotional effect. So you'll pick out two things in there. Figurative language, meaning that poetry is not saying exactly what it means. It's using some kinds of figures of speech. And then also emotional effect. The goal of poetry almost always is to make you have some sort of feeling. Now, when you look at poems, they're broken up different than stories or essays. They're broken up into lines, not necessarily sentences with punctuation at the end, but lines on the paper. And then those lines are grouped together in stanzas. A stanza is a group of lines which forms a unit in a poem, sort of like a paragraph, but not exactly. If you look at the poem to the right here, you'll see that this poem is broken up into 4 stanzas of 4 lines. It's a very structured poem. Now, another important term for you to understand when we're talking about poetry is the speaker. The speaker is the voice in a poem. It's similar to the narrator in a story. It's not the same as the poet or the author. Sometimes the speaker might be an inanimate object or an animal. It could be a lot of different things, but whenever you see a question asking about the speaker, what it's asking about is the voice that's saying the poem. All right, there are lots of different types of poetry, but today we're going to just talk about sort of 3 big categories. And those are narrative, which are poems that tell a story. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They have a plot. You could put them on a plot diagram. Those are narrative poems. Sort of the inverse of that is a lyric poem. A lyric poem doesn't tell a story, but it expresses thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Then there's what's called a free verse poem. And free verse poems are poems that don't really have a fixed pattern. They don't have rhyme or meter or a specific line length or stanza arrangement. Free verse poems could be narrative, but they could also be lyric. If you look at the poem on the left here, you'll see a free verse poem. You'll see that the lines don't necessarily follow a strict pattern. There's no specific stanza arrangement. That's what we call a free verse poem. Most of the time when teachers or tests ask you about a poem, they're asking you to analyze the poem or to evaluate the poem. And what that means is they want you to look at the tools that the author uses. What are the devices that the author uses in the poems, and then how do those impact the strength of the poem or the quality of the poem? So the first step that we need to take is making sure we understand what some of those devices are. And this is stuff that you've definitely had before in middle school, but it's stuff that's good to review. So today we're going to start by taking a look at sound devices, which are one type of device that poets often use to add meaning to their poems. Rhyme is probably the most well-known and most easy to pick out sound device. And rhyme is any time that the sound is repeated at the end of a line of a poem. So if one line ends in the word black and the next line ends in the word lack, then that's a rhyme, when the 2 lines end with words that have a similar sound. Now, another frequently used sound device in poetry is rhythm. And rhythm is the pattern that's created by the arrangement of stressed and unstressed syllables. You can think about rhythm like the beat in music. It's that downbeat, that stress and unstressed syllable. A sort of quirky sound device that poets sometimes use is onomatopoeia. And that's a big word, but it basically means the use of a word or phrase that sounds like what it describes. So knock or drip, those are onomatopoeia words. They sound like what they're describing. Now, the sound device that we're going to focus on the most today is repetition. And repetition can happen anytime there's a recurrence of sounds, words, phrases, lines, or stanzas. And poetry is often full of repetition. Now, we're going to dial in on a few specific types of repetition today. The first is called alliteration. And alliteration is the repetition of a sound at the start of two or more words. So if you think about all those tongue twisters that you learned, she sells seashells by the seashore. That's alliteration. It's the repetition of that sound at the start of a bunch of words. Another sound device is assonance. And assonance is the repetition of words that have very similar vowel sounds. So if you were to say, it was like a bright night, that's assonance. We've got the I, the similar vowel sound repeated over and over. That's assonance. Now, consonance is the repetition of a consonant sound, especially at the end of syllables. So if you were to say something like, it was a lark, not a dog, I heard bark in the dark. That k sound being repeated at the end of all those different words and different syllables is consonants. Now, that was a quick review of some of the sound devices that poets use. Take a minute, pause this video, and make sure you've got good notes on all of those before going on to looking at the poem. All right, now let's take a look at a poem. Go ahead and flip your note sheets over to the back and open your Bronx Masquerade book to page 10 and 11. On those pages, you'll find the poem Attendance by Tyrone Biddings. It's the first poem where we get to hear Tyrone's voice. We're going to read through this poem. I'm going to actually play the audio, and you're going to listen to the poem. And as you're listening, I want you to follow along and pay specific attention to sound devices. You can pause it at any time and see if you can find examples of all of those sound devices that we've been talking about. Now, on your practice sheet, write down the line, the words of the line, where you find that specific sound device being used. Take your time, pause this, go back and replay it if you need to. We'll talk about this as a whole class after everybody's had a chance to listen and see if they can pick out these sound devices in attendance.
Open Mic, Attendance by Tyrone Biddings. We are all here. Leslie and Bad Boy, Lupe and Raul, here, and here. Dear Mr. Ward with his wards and wardettes, let's have a show of hands today. Is Portia here? Is Deandra here? Where is Sheila? It's me, Tyrone, up here all alone, rapping into a microphone, cause I've got something to say. MTV is here. Mirror and Morning Spacewalks are here. Terrorism is here, lurking at the bus stop. Can't hop on the subway without thinking of Tokyo. We all know poison gas does not discriminate. It's too late to worry about my innocence since fear is here. Why is it a weekend visit to your local Mickey D's may be deadly? Why hasn't somebody sensed a death? Don't hold your breath waiting. Still you can chill and celebrate all that's great about life, like music and the tick, tick, tick of time, which is equal parts yours and mine, to make of the world what we will. But first say no to coke and smoke, say no to police brutality and causing fatality. Say no to race hate, don't underestimate the power of love. But most of all, take 2 poems and call me in the morning.
All right, now that you've listened to it, go back, listen to it again if you need to, look at it in the book, and make sure you can find examples of all of the different sound devices that we've talked about today. Now remember, sound devices are just one tool that a poet has, and we will keep coming back and looking at other tools, but overall, what I want you to be doing is thinking about how do these tools impact the poem? How does this poem make you feel, and how do these tools contribute to that feeling? So think about that and write one little short paragraph response down there at the bottom of your paper about that, and then we'll talk about all of this as a class.